Yeah, good morning, everyone. So lovely for me and Eric to be here today. And Eric, I wonder, would you like to start and just quickly introduce yourself? I see we have colleagues all over the world, from Australia and Mozambique and some
Yes.
locals. So yeah, please take the opportunity to tell them who you are.
Thank you, Anja. Good morning, everybody. My name's Eric Albertini. So I am the founder and CEO of a company called Future Fit Academy. We work in the future world of work. We work on upskilling people on emergent skills, one of them being problem solving and resolving conflict, which we'll talk about. Based in Johannesburg, in not so nice weather at the moment, rather cold, lots of power cuts, water shortages. But other than that, all good, and I'm looking forward to the session. Thank you, Anja.
But Eric, I would like to know, other than what you bring to the world in the sense of supporting the corporate world, what is a little known fact about yourself that you can share with us today?
So, well, Anja, one of the interesting things I've done in the last couple of months, in the early part of February, I was fortunate enough to go to Italy. I'm of Italian descent, and I did a 14-day cooking course in Tuscany, in a villa in Tuscany, which was quite an experience. And I'm certainly getting stuck into that. So that I don't think a lot of people know.
Well, that sounds awesome. Yeah. So let me take a moment to introduce myself. So good morning, everyone. I'm Anja van Beek. I'm based here in Pretoria. And what I do for a living is something that I absolutely love. My corporate career, I was in HR. In my last corporate role, head of HR for a big multinational. And about 7 years ago, I took the leap of faith and started my own coaching and consulting business. And I focus on 3 areas. Firstly, one-on-one and group coaching. I do a lot of work around leadership development. And then thirdly, helping companies to thrive. So having a look at how do you build that culture where people can bring their best selves to the world of work. And I'm super excited, Eric, to collaborate today with you on critical thinking, problem solving, and conflict management.
Yeah. And Anja, a little known fact about you.
So I think we align on the traveling one, because my little known fact would be that I would say that travel is my therapy. Not that you always get as much chance to travel as you can. But perhaps the little known fact was when I finished my studies, I traveled abroad for about 2 years, and I hitchhiked to the Niagara waterfall. So that would be my little known fact. Luckily, my mom did not know what I was doing at that time, but yeah, that's my little known fact.
Good, excellent. Looking forward to the session.
Yeah, good.
So we thought we would start off the session this morning by asking you to have a look at these 10 worries that people have about the world of work. And we'd like you to just pick 1 or 2 that really, really concern you. So in the research and in the work that Anja and I do, we often work with corporates and teams on what about the future world of work worries them most. And these are some of the comments that are often raised. Now, by way of a poll, we'd just like to get a sense from the people that are on the call now, on the webinar, what is it that worries you most about the future world of work? So you'll see there's a QR code on the screen, which you can scan in with your smartphone, and it'll take you straight into the app, and then please select, and we will show the results, live real-time results, as people are selecting from the 10. We just want to get a sense from those of you on the call, what are the issues about this future world of work that trouble you? So if you wouldn't mind doing that.
And I think that's such an important question, Eric, and I'm so pleased to see that we have people immediately sharing their views round about almost 30 already. I see we
Yeah.
have many more on the call. So yeah, we would be keen to hear what are the things that worry you most about the future. Yeah, and we have not included the load shedding.
Yeah, nice. We've normalized that here, so it doesn't even worry us anymore. So there we go, 50 odd people. We'll just let it run for a couple more seconds. And I think, while we wait for others to vote and to answer the questions, I mean, all of these things are worries. To some degree, I mean, we could have asked you to prioritize them from 1 to 10, because in fact, all 10 may to some extent be things that you consider. But we just want to get a sense of which ones are in particular worries for the group. So that's 96 people that have done it now. And I think that gives us a good sense, Anja. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. And I see we definitely have top 3. That's evident on the screen. On my side, Eric, it's relatively small, but I'm sure we can see which one they have selected here.
yeah.
But thank you so much, everyone, for contributing here.
Well, I mean, Anja, what does come out, obviously, and we've seen this picture, I think, a few times before, this growing conflict, inequality, extremism, prejudices is obviously a concern. And it's linked to the second highest, which is automation, digital technologies, this whole explosion of artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, and other AI applications. But what we do know, the research that we've done at Future Fit, is the reality, the unfortunate reality is that inequality and extremism is going to increase. We are seeing increases across the world. People that don't have access to the augmented reality, the virtual reality, the robotics, all the technological enhancements, in some way are getting left further behind. We do know that jobs are being affected by technology. It's not, the World Economic Forum paints a very harsh picture around the hundreds of thousands of jobs that are going to be possibly lost, but there will be many that are going to be created. And maybe jobs won't be lost, but roles will change. But one thing that this is going to cause is increased conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
Expect there to be more conflict. And then, the automation is there. I mean, uncertainty and ambiguity, which is the third highest, is also the world of work that we are moving into is becoming more uncertain, more ambiguous, and it's going to present more problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to pick up on that, please.
Yeah, and I think what comes to mind, Eric, when I look at these things, I think the unfortunate reality for all of us is that the change that we see is not going to go away. So often I speak to clients and they say, let's just get through whatever we're busy with. It might be the automation, or it might be, as you say, a specific change in the digital technology world or whatever. And as soon as that change is over, then we can take that, okay, now we can focus on work again. And I think the unfortunate reality is that change is not going to go away. It will actually just go faster and faster. And I think that is why in this world where we see so many technology changes, it is critical for us to focus on those human connections and as you say, the human side of things. When we think of the growing conflict, and perhaps a few years ago, it was okay to get away with not being able to handle these as eloquently. But I think today it's absolute a necessity for people to consider how do they show up in this ever-changing world of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anja, that's a good segue into this next piece that we just wanted to share with the people. So when we talk about the future world of work, there are many different models, and people say, what does this future world of work mean? So just a couple of points that I'd like to raise. We all talk about the future as if it is going to happen in a very extended time period. The reality is that, the future is here. The future is now. Anja and I work with clients that have been using drone technology for security instead of security guards for years. The client I'm referring to, I think, started deploying drone technology to secure their premises in 2018, 2019, way before the pandemic. The other thing, just to be clear, the pandemic has not caused this world of work. It's accelerated it. A lot of what we're seeing was on the cards. It was going to happen. But if we look at the future world of work models, and not to spend too much time on this, but I think we're all familiar with VUCA, where this world of work it's volatile, it's changing all the time. Uncertainty is the norm of the day. We say that anybody who battles to embrace uncertainty is in trouble, because there's going to just be so much uncertainty. It's going to be ongoing. It's going to get more and bigger, complex. There are multiple dimensions. The world is an integrated puzzle. We see the Ukraine war and the impact it's had globally. So it's very complex and it's ambiguous. Information is uncertain. The model that I want to just spend a bit of time on is this BANI, the so-called BANI model of the future world of work. This world of work is brittle. Brittle meaning it can come undone. It can break quickly. Now, again, if something's brittle and it breaks quickly, problems have to be solved. People have to approach this world of work with a solutionist mindset because of this brittleness that can come unraveled quickly. It causes a massive amount of anxiety. And I think we all know the statistics around mental health and wellness, the so-called next pandemic. And there's anxiety. There's anxiety at individual levels. There's anxiety at corporate level. We talk about organizational anxiety. Non-linear, we can't predict the future from the past as we could have a little while back. So this concept of forward planning and strategic planning and taking the past and trying to extrapolate it and prepare a plan for the future doesn't work, because what we're going to see in the future is not necessarily going to be coming from the past. And then this incomprehensible, we can expect in the future world of work to really see and have to deal with things that we could not have previously thought were possible. Completely incomprehensible. And that's going to require problem solving. It's going to require critical thinking. This incomprehensible world of work, where we are going to be faced with things that we could not have thought possible, is going to require this very agile, problem-solving, critical thinking mindset that is very adept at mastering conflict resolution. So the BANI model for us, this brittleness, anxiety, non-linearity, and incomprehensibility for us is particularly critical. The tuna model, turbulent, uncertain, novel. I think novel is quite interesting. We're going to, novel similar to incomprehensible, we're going to be faced with things that are new and that we would not have seen or thought of before. And then, of course, from the Center for Creative Leadership, we've got RUCT, the RUCT model, rapid, the pace at which things are changing, again, unpredictable. The paradoxical one is an interesting one, because the world of work will require us to think both and. This concept of thinking either this or that is a thing of the past. Effective leaders are going to have to think, how do I do both this and that? It's this polarity thinking. It's dealing with paradox. So critical thinking, problem solving comes in there. And then it's tangled. It's a mess of tangled, complex, intertwined things. So this is the world that we're in and moving further into. And it's against this context that problem solving and conflict resolution and collaboration become absolutely must-have skills. It's not negotiable. People who can't master these are truly going to be left behind. Anja?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Eric, you explained it so well. I perhaps can just add on to that, when you mentioned about BANI and the anxiousness. And it's actually so sad to see whenever I work with either one-on-one or the group coaching, is that I do see that people tend to, as you mentioned, that mental health, it's a real challenge for us at the moment. And then for us then as leaders to think, but how do we then create an environment where we can support these people? But I love what you said about we cannot no longer just sit back and think that the tools that we had before is sufficient. We need to level up and say, okay, not only how do I take care of myself and my mental health, but then definitely my teams, because that anxiety levels is definitely increasing. And I think that's also bringing it to the table that it's not necessarily only the leader and the manager's role, but for each of us as individuals to take ownership of our own self-led, leadership in our own mental health, learning to put those boundaries in place where needed.
Yeah, absolutely, Anja. I think we have to, in this world that we are moving into, that we're already into, moving further into, we have to, it's about you, it's about us. It's the individual is going to have to take more of an active role and responsibility in his/her development and mastery of some of these skills. Just another thing, as you were talking, Anja, that I reflected on, the conflict, the problem solving and conflict will come from the disruptors. So there's a whole bunch of disruptors that drive this so-called world of work. Longevity, people will live longer. We know that. The generational conflict, borders coming down. There are physical borders in some countries that, on the Africa continent in particular, that may dissipate, that may come down. We've got the superstructured organization. We've got the gig worker. We've got this hybrid work from home story. So all of that causes this anxiety. It causes problems to be solved as and when we move, and of course, conflict. So we have to take it, it's up to us, the individual, to build this internal resilience and this core of I can solve problems. First of all, I can spot them before they actually happen, ideally. I can then problem solve and solution. We, in the Future Fit, Anja and I talk a lot about, it's about problem dissolving, not problem solving. You want to almost recreate the context so that the problem disappears. It doesn't help that we put a plaster on the wound and apply superficial treatment. So this solutioning mindset, this ability to spot a problem, and this absolute problem dissolving becomes critical. And that takes us into the problem solving process. Now on the program on problem solving, we talk a lot about the 6-step problem solving, a generic problem solving model. And very often people think that they do step 1, step 2, step 3. And it is linear to a point, but it's also iterative. It's a little bit like the design thinking process. And you can see on the screen the 6 steps that we cover in the course on problem solving. It's defining the problem. It's then, of course, determining the root cause or causes of the problem. And then developing solutions, selecting a solution, implementing a solution, and evaluating the outcome, which on a diagram like this looks deceivingly simple. And what we do want to zoom in today on this mini masterclass is step 1, because the essence of problem solving is understanding the real problem. And what we find happens very often when we work with teams is that they put a lot of effort into solving what they think is the problem. And in fact, it's not. They're solving a symptom. So the cautionary note and the importance of step 1, which is what we've chosen to focus on today, is articulating and identifying the root cause of the problem. Rather spend more time debating and questioning to identify the real problem. the Western world of work in particular prides its leaders for decisiveness. So in the Western world of work in particular, leaders are hailed as heroes when they take action quickly. So there's this need for leaders to act quickly and decisively. Now, I'm not taking that away. I'm not saying that that's not important. What I am saying is that sometimes what tends to happen is we're so focused on acting quickly that we act quickly on the wrong thing. And this step number one, this definition of the problem, is about almost sitting in suspense. It's almost asking the questions to get to the real root cause of the problem. Anja, do you want to add anything to that point?
Not necessarily. I think looking at the problem solving, Eric, that's something that you focus on more than me, I would say. But I think to add on to that is, even if you then have a look at the conflict management, although the process might be different, I think it's really that first step of let me be very clear on what it is that I want to have a conversation about. Because often we think, as you said, it might be X, but there's root causes that we conveniently forget or choose not to talk about, because that might be the more challenging part to address.
Absolutely.
But yeah, let's go back to the problem solving side then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, Anja, you raise an important point. So this problem solving process is not an individual process. It needn't be. So very often leaders, when confronted with a problem, may think that they are on their own in solving this problem. But in fact, the best way to solve a problem, as we know, is through collaborative effort, where we bring diverse people together who will then co-create the solution. I mean, that's how it works. But in most cases, at that very first step, defining their problem, that's when we would first probably encounter conflict. So the example I often use, which a lot of people can relate to, if sales is down in an organization, if the revenue is down, now we call a meeting to say, we're not meeting our revenue targets, what's the problem? So finance will say, well, the price, the costing, we're not doing the proper costing. The salespeople will say, we're not doing enough advertising. Ops may say, well, our salespeople are terrible. Now, the problem is revenue is down, or is it? Is that a symptom? Low revenue or not meeting revenue targets is not the problem. Yeah, it is a problem, obviously, but why? And that then would take us into a conversation, a very robust, honest, courageous conversation about what are the possible hypotheses, what could be possible causes of this low revenue. Is it our salespeople are ineffective? Is our pricing not? Is our marketing ineffective? Are we costing it incorrectly? So that already is where there would be conflict in this identification and articulating of the real root cause. And that's the link we wanted to bring to you today between problem solving and conflict resolution and, of course, critical thinking.
So, Eric, I see we have Crystal that has raised her hand. Let's perhaps hear if she can unmute and ask the question. We want it to be interactive. So, Crystal, if you can unmute, kindly do so and ask your question.
Sorry, I think that was an accident.
Ah, okay.
I do want to ask a question anyway.
No, it's. I think, yeah, I had a situation 2 weeks ago where I actually applied this exact process, and it seems to be working. I always say go back to the root cause is very, very important, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself. I'm almost 50. And back in the day, we weren't taught about root cause analysis, but I think the future and the younger generation knows about the root cause. So especially when you're going for interviews and stuff, people, I only learned about the root cause when I went for my very first interview a few years ago. I mean, I'm 48. I'm just going to put it out there. I never knew about the root cause. But the important part is what I applied in my job was actually root cause. I just didn't have a name for it until someone told me this is root cause. I'm like, oh, but I've been doing that for years. you know. And I'm going to be honest, in the interview, the lady mentioned the root cause, and I was like, what is that? And then she said, oh, explain. And then she actually, the interviewer said to me, but you've been applying root cause for all your life. You just didn't know, you just didn't have a name for it, because back in the day when I still went for my first interview when I was 20, root cause wasn't a word back then.
Yeah. And Crystal, if I could just pick up on that, because you do raise an interesting point. We all have different thinking styles. Some of us are more critical thinkers, others are more analytical thinkers. Some of us could be adaptive thinkers. And when solving a problem, we tend to bring our preferred thinking style to the table. So one of the things that we do in our problem-solving course is we help individuals understand their thinking style and how to enhance it. So you may have...
It's those meetings, unlock the power, what.
Hello? There's a lot of what's there, but... okay. So Crystal, I think you make a very good point, which I just wanted to hook up onto because it's important. Part of effective problem solving and conflict management, for that point, is one needs to know oneself. Any development, and Anja, you can come in here. Any development has to start with an acknowledgement of where you are at. What is your preferred thinking style? What is your conflict resolution style? Anja will talk about that. But to Crystal's point, you may not know what your thinking style is. You may not have known that for the years you were applying, root cause analysis. Maybe you haven't really become aware that you're a very strong critical thinker, as opposed to a reflective thinker, as opposed to analytical, creative. They're different thinking styles. So yeah, thank you for that. It's useful just to, the point I'm making is become aware of your preferences in terms of thinking and obviously in terms of resolving conflict. Where are you starting from here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a little bit later when we look at the three different conflicts that we can face every day is, as you said, exactly. There's one where we need to be very, very self-aware. And I think it is important, Eric, the better we know one another, and I think the terminology you use is your thinking preferences. And so with the conflict management, when you understand your conflict style, I'm one that's avoiding the conflict, or I'm a conflict seeker, or I'm the one that's collaborating, or whatever it might be. That's usually the starting point of the learning, because it starts with that awareness, and then you can build from there.
Absolutely. And just to go back to this defining the problem. So I've already, suggested that in some instances, leaders move too quickly because we are rewarded for quick action, decisiveness. And obviously, if the problem requires immediate, urgent attention, then you're not going to have too much time to reflect. So if you're a firefighter and you get to a building and you have to put out this fire, well, then clearly, you will apply problem solving, but you're going to have to act very quickly. And in fact, you may have to try a whole lot of things that you didn't think you were going to try. So time, urgency, and decisiveness impact problem solving.
So, Eric, we have two more hands that's raised. Let's quickly hear from them. I hope I'm pronouncing the names correctly. The first one is Rudzani. He had his hand up for quite some time, so let's quickly hear from him. And then Bronwyn also raised her hand.
And I think Eric just spoke to the issue I wanted to ask earlier, especially from a time element perspective, and when one has to do a root cause, to then say, what are some of the tools that we can use to try and balance the equation where there's an element of agency, but there's also an element of inclusivity in the process, because you don't want to do this in isolation. You also need to make sure that there's inclusivity in the process. So what are some of the tools that one can then use to balance time, agency, versus inclusivity in the process, and the element of results, which sometimes can then talk to sustainability of the solution that you come up with.
Ruzani, an excellent question. We will make available to you today a link to an article, a resource that answers that question exactly. You'll see in there are 7 techniques or tools to identify the problem, to define and identify the problem. And in that resource that you will be given, it tells you when to use each of these 7, and it tells you the time that it'll take to resolve the problem, or to identify the problem, sorry, using those resources. But I think just to say, you'll get that. You will be sent that link, that resource. I think another important point on your question is we've got to look at the criticality of the problem and the impact that it's having. So sales are down. Let me use my example again. Sales are down. If the problem is, as a result of sales, I don't have cash flow to pay my salaries at the end of the month, I've got to get money in the next week. Otherwise, I'm not going to pay salaries at the end of the month. Then I'm going to apply one of those 7 techniques that says, I'm kind of going to put a plaster on the wound for now. I'm going to put a tourniquet on it. I need to stop the bleeding. I need to get my cash flow up and going, and I need to pay salaries. And so you'll almost approach the problem solving in 2 phases. One is an immediate stopgap. I've got to stop the bleeding. I've got to make sure that I get cash in the bank in the next 3 weeks. And now I'm going to look for outstanding invoices that haven't been paid. I'm going to discount my product to get cash in now. I'll come up with a discount structure to whatever the case is. And in the background, I'm doing a more thorough identification of the root causes. So, Ruzani, you'll see that in the resource that we will distribute.
Right, lovely. Thanks, Eric. And I see Bronwyn as well. And then perhaps after Bronwyn's question, we can then continue. But Bronwyn, please unmute and share.
Sure. So I've popped my question into the chat. My question is, when we're doing problem solving, like reactive, fast, decisive, so I'm from a very strong sales environment and we're under pressure all the time. What happens is we're doing problem solving, but it leads to blame storming. So sales says, oh, the leads are bad. The marketing guy says, no, the leads are enough, but they're getting expensive. So how do we slow things down so that we can rather do problem dissolving with constructive brainstorming and not finger pointing, etc.? So for me, that would be a big win, given that we are in such a pressured environment that we literally are trying to put out fires every single minute of every single day.
So Bronwyn, I think, again, another brilliant question, and that is exactly what happens. In reality, if we just stick with my example that you've just related to the sales, you're going to get blamed. You're going to get people blaming. You're going to get scapegoating, and everyone blames each other. This is where collaborative problem solving comes in, as opposed to you doing it. So now, to collaborate, a couple of things need to be in place. If the sales team or the stakeholders, not just sales, if the stakeholders, including finance, including ops, marketing, whomever, if there's no trust, there's going to be a problem, another problem. Not the sales that are low, it's going to be another problem. So psychological safety, trust building are critical underpinning things that need to be in place for effective collaborative problem solving. The other thing is the trust that must be between people must be trust of credibility. The salespeople ought to have credibility in the eyes of the other stakeholders. Finance must have credibility in terms of their role and function. So we talk about trust in this context, not trust from an integrity perspective necessarily, but a credibility perspective. If Bronwyn comes to me and says, our leads are not good leads, will I believe her? And then, of course, Bronwyn, we need to rely on the data. In our course on problem solving, we go into the use of data, because data sometimes is overlooked when we are trying to urgently solve the problem. So now we need to do that. We need the data. How many leads? What was the conversion from the lead generation to the appointment setting, to the proposal submission, to closing proposals? And let's be informed by the data. So in identifying the true problem, it's quite an objective and sometimes data-driven process, not a subjective ideation process. When we get to finding the solution, then we can switch into top right brain thinking and be a little bit more subjective and brainstorm and ideate and all of that. But in step one, this identifying the root problem, be guided by the data. Interrogate the data. In this trusting, psychologically safe environment, with everyone's voice being heard. I think, to go back to Rizwani's question, you want to include everybody. You want to hear everybody's voice. And if time permits, then include as many people as you can. If, as I said earlier on, I've got to get cash in the bank to pay salaries at the end of July, I might have to take some decisions as the leader, quite drastic decisions, without doing the full-blown defining of the problem. But again, in the work, when we do the module, we definitely go into data-driven problem-solving techniques, because you've got to look at the data.
Yeah, and I think, Eric, let me build on what you've mentioned, because on the conflict management in the workshop that links back to what you mentioned about the collaboration, there's a tool and a technique that we share with the learners about boundary spanning. And I think it's such a beautiful concept where we need to reach out to people that's not in our close vicinity. It might be different departments, it might even be different industries, whatever the case might be. But I love that concept of, let's consider, who do you need to collaborate with in order to solve the problem in I almost want to say, in a novel way.
Yeah. I'm just reading a comment here in the chat here. Somebody asked here, I've noticed that there are many methodologies and concepts for problem solving. There's Lean, Kaizen, Six Sigma, which do I think is the best? It very often, so I really do like Kaizen. I'm a big proponent of Kaizen. I just want to say one thing. Sometimes when problem solving and when identifying the problem, we tend to over-engineer the problem. We create a level of complexity where complexity needn't exist. And now we bring in a whole lot of stuff, models, frameworks, and we get so confused that the application of the methodology becomes the problem. Never mind the problem that we started off solving. So sometimes it's better to, I'm a firm believer in this mantra that says there's elegance in simplicity. Let's just be, if we can, and we'll stay with our sales example. The sales are down. People are not buying our product. Let's put down 5 statements as to possible reasons. Then let's go and look for data to support those hypotheses. Let's interrogate the data to see if these 5 points we've put down are in fact potential problems. The other thing that I just want to mention, excuse me, is that we may find that there's an integrated problem. So our low revenue could be partly lead generation. We're getting poor leads, and the unique proposition of our product isn't clearly articulated in the marketplace. So that's a double whammy. And then again, the question is now what do we do? Are there two separate problems? The answer is yes, and we may have to solve them simultaneously to solve the so-called bigger problem or the manifestation, which is low revenue. So yeah, I really, going back to the question that was posed in the chat, sometimes it's not one methodology. A skilled problem solver will draw on tools or practices or techniques from Kaizen, from Lean, from Six Sigma. It's about this versatility of bouncing between the tools to, in fact, solve the problem. So that would be my response to that question. Can we move on to the next? Yeah. So just a quick quiz again, please. Which of the following is a good problem statement? Again, as you did in the previous one, you've got 3 problem statements there. Which of those do you think is a good problem statement? So we've got 23 people. We'll give it another minute or so.
Eric, I think you're on mute still.
You muted, Eric. There we go.
And Anja, was that you? Someone muted me. Maybe I
think it was me, Eric. No offense. No, just joking.
Okay. So, sorry, yeah, the answer is definitely B. A, which said it takes too long to find information. That's the impact of the problem. That's how the problems manifest. In the B is the right answer. If we look at C, we are losing customers. That's too broad. So while we did this little exercise, what we focus on a lot in the module is your problem statement has to be the right balance, if I can use that term, between being too descriptive of the result, the impact, and being too broad. We are losing customers. I mean, obviously, at a very high level, it is a problem, but it's not going to do it. The problem statement should, to some extent, point you in the direction of the solution. So when we look at our problem of low revenue and we come up with these potential hypotheses, as they're sometimes called, we want to select the one that gives us a sense, it points us a little bit in the direction of a potential solution. So B, we lose too many customers because their calls for support take too long. It's giving you some indication of where a possible solution may come from. If I speed up the query resolution time, I'd be okay. So, it's definitely B that we would want to go. A is about the impact. C is too broad. We are losing. So now what does that tell me? B, it says, okay, we're losing customers and a potential cause of loss of customers could be the time taken on the call center to resolve the problem. So short little exercise there, just to make the point that there's a balance between having too narrowly defined a problem statement and one that is more about the impact rather than a potential cause. B has a potential cause. I see there's a hand up. I can't seem to see. Here we are. Rudzani, have you got another question? Or okay, go on.
Yes, I've got another question.
Yes,
maybe just on the B, doesn't that preempt the cause? If we're looking at the process where we define the problem and then there's an element of root cause.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
It does. And you almost want to define the problem. A good problem statement alludes to a possible cause. You may go now and investigate this a little bit more and find that actually the time taken is not too long. It's within industry norm. Then you would drop the hypothesis. So what I'm saying is, if we're losing customers, if our sales are down or whatever, you may have 4 or 5 statements like statement B. And when you define the problem, part of that defining the problem is almost eliminating those that the data or information doesn't support. So it is intended to kind of guide you to a potential cause that you will interrogate. And then if the data keeps saying, you know what, yes, the time taken is too long, well, then we'll carry on down that road until we've confirmed, and that is the final root cause. The time on the call center takes too long. Support is too long. That's the problem. So do you get what I'm saying? It could be that we need some prompt in the beginning for us to then clearly articulate the problem. I saw there was another question, if I'm not mistaken, or not.
I don't see another hand. Not at this point, Eric.
All right. If we just move on to the next one. So which is bad? Have a look at these 3 problem statements now. Here you got 3 problem statements. Which is a bad one? Which is one that's really not good? Same process. And then you can tell us why. So remember here, we're wanting to just get a sense of which of these 3 statements is a bad problem statement. And I think, while we just wait for a couple more people to complete it, there are certain criteria or rules that we cover on what makes a good problem statement. So what should a problem statement have and what shouldn't it have? And it's against those criteria that we're saying this is a good or a bad problem statement. But in this one here, which are the bad problem statement? Which is the bad problem statement? Okay, so yeah, 76 people completed. I think we can move on. So the one that least meets the requirements, of an effective problem statement is C. Students who take more than 4 modules, aren't sure when assignments are due, and need a system that arranges assignments by due date. Now, what that statement is telling me is, so that you got these students that take more than 4 modules, they aren't sure when their assignments are due, but it doesn't tell me why. Why are they not sure? They need a system that arranges assignments in due dates, but is that the solution? Is it an innovative, creative solution? So when we apply the test of creativity, C is the one that gives us the least amount of information. And of course, I mean, the criteria that I'm talking about, the criteria that I'm referring to, we unpack in the module in a lot more detail, because there are these 5 criteria that make for a good problem statement. One of the criteria is even the languaging, the narrative. So students who take more than 4 modules aren't sure when assignments are due. Why are they not sure? Is it on a different portal? Is it because there is no, the assignments are not arranged by due date? If it says it, in statement C, it says they need a system that arranges assignments in due date. But is that the reason why they're not sure when they do? I mean, if the students have got the due dates for 4 assignments, why do they need a system that arranges them by due dates? So again, very quick exercise given the time we have on this masterclass, but the idea that we wanted to get across is, when constructing this problem statement or statements that you're going to then select from to identify the true root cause, the problem statement has to meet certain criteria. There's a certain narrative that you want to include in the problem statement. And by the way, I didn't mention this earlier on, and perhaps I should have. Problem statement is not a page. We've worked with teams where you ask them for the problem statement, and it's just too much. A problem statement is literally 2 sentences maximum. Ideally, 1 sentence. It's like your elevator pitch in sales. If someone gets into the lift, you've got 30 seconds to tell them what you do and the value of what you do, the why of what you do. You got to have that captured in a sentence. And the same thing with a problem statement. So just those 2 exercises very quickly. There are bad problem statements. There are good problem statements. The difference between the good and the bad is these criteria that I speak about that make for an effective problem statement. Anja, to you. Can we move on to the next piece? Are there any questions?
Definitely. And I think that was so lovely. And I think it's re-emphasizing what you said earlier, Eric, about the simplicity. So be concise and be clear. And I love that what you say. It's not a page. It's just 1 or 2 sentences long. So let's have a look at the next slide. We're talking about essential skills and critical skills. And I was almost thinking, Eric, if we can pause this one and perhaps at the end talk about this, but what I think is essential for our listeners to understand today is that so often people use the term, it's a soft skill, And I think in today's world, there's no such thing as a soft skill, especially for people that's in a leadership role, that it is critical for us to move, to be effective when we have to navigate in all these uncertainties. And I think when we think about problem solving, and especially thinking about conflict management, the way that we communicate, you spoke about the narrative, the choice of words. I think that is so essential. But let's circle back to that one and perhaps just then have a look at this one here. Eric, I don't know if you want to talk to where the problem solving and the conflict resolution meet, but I think it's really focused on all these wicked problems that we've spoke about. The lack of resources, the technology, the digitalization of the workplace, and all those wicked problems in the end, as we said earlier, makes the conflict management, the problem solving and decision making so important. And then if we have a look at these two axes on the emotional and the rational side on the one side, and then the process and where we need to have intuition or intuitiveness when making decisions, I think it's back to your point of how quickly do we make decisions. I don't know if you want to elaborate on this slide, Eric.
Anja, I mean, very briefly, when conflict, problem solving and decision making come together, that's when leaders grapple. Because now there's a problem I've got to solve, I've got to take a decision, and I'm in conflict with other stakeholders. That puts me in a tough spot. And that's when those critical skills then become absolutely critical. In this situation, when I'm faced with this wicked problem and there's conflict, there's a problem I've got to solve, and there's decision making. And again, I don't want to belabor the point here, but when, studying problem solving and talking to people in different industries, I go back to the emergency services. When the firefighters get to a scene, they haven't got time for conflict. Imagine if they stood in front of the burning building having an argument about which hose pipe to use. I mean, that wouldn't be very good. They've got to solve the problem. I've got to get this fire out. I've got to get these people out of the building or whatever. The decision making in that type of environment is very quick. And it's hierarchical because each team has a leader. And if the team leader says, hose pipe 1, go through that door and do that, ladder 2, go and do that, there's no debate. It happens with almost like with military precision.
Yeah.
In the corporate world, what happens? Egos get in the way. Fear gets in the way. Anja and I have spoken about this before. A lot of the times what causes terrible things to happen in organizations is when those two words get in the way. Fear and ego. Because now people fear being wrong. We fear failure. Failure has been stigmatized. We fear losing our jobs. We fear being reprimanded. We fear looking silly. Ego. I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to let people know that I've been wrong. And now that creates a dynamic which makes it difficult. So just an awareness here around when conflict is present, when there's a problem, and when a decision is needed, those things come together. Intuition is an interesting one because intuition is about knowing what to do when you don't know what to do. Intuition is also about knowing without knowing why. I was on a call the other day with people from Harvard Business School. They have just added a module to their MBA called Knowing Without Knowing Why. The power of strategic intuition. Now, in the Western world of work, we are told if there's no logical reasoning in the top left quadrant of the brain, then you can't take this decision. You can't solve this problem. Sometimes, if we look at the Eastern philosophy and we look at duality models and even some of the like Toyota, Japanese culture, Japanese focus, they encourage thinking with your gut. And that's where this intuition comes in. Sometimes decision making and decisions taken need to be taken with some element of gut thinking. And by the way, and then we can move on, every one of us on this call is intuitive. It's just that some people have learned how to stop it and block it, and other people have learned how to continue to harness it. But we were born curious and intuitive. And through our life's travels, we have shunted curiosity and we have stifled intuition. But it's an important concept that needs to be brought into decision making. I'm not saying replace logical reasoning with intuition. I'm saying add to it, because sometimes decisions are made with gut feel.
Sure, Eric, That's such an important point. It really comes back to what you said earlier on about those thinking preferences.
Yeah.
Because in the end, even though your thinking preference, as you mentioned, might be the logical one, we now need to think whole brain, and we now need to think of, okay, so where do I need to use the gut? And even if it feels very uncomfortable, and as you say, I might be afraid of taking that risk, but
Absolutely.
sometimes that's exactly what's needed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Spot on.
absolutely.
100%. 100%.
Yeah. Great. And I think let's then move on and talk a little bit about the concept of psychological safety. And I think why it is so important, Eric, for us to touch base on psychological safety is when we think of a culture where we want our people to be critical thinkers and where we want our teams to be problem solvers, we need to be vigilant about creating this environment where we have psychological safety. And very similar when you then think of conflict management. I mean, when you think of, let's say, interpersonal conflict where I have a disagreement, let's say, with you, or we are at odds about a decision that we need to make. It's a, I almost want to say we need to have psychological safety in place. Otherwise, those environments will just not be conducive to solving the problems or to encourage people to, take risks or to just experiment and make mistakes and learn from there.
Yeah.
And I think whenever I think of psychological safety, I mean, I love Brené Brown's definition where she said that if we want our people to show up, to solve problems, to serve our customers, we need to be so focused on creating that environment where they feel seen, heard, and respected. And I think often leaders overlook this point of building the psychological safety. I quite like the book by Timothy Clark, where he spoke about 4 different levels of psychological safety. And the first one being the inclusive safety, and then talking about learner safety, contribution safety, and then lastly, challenger safety. And I think especially when we think of critical thinking, problem solving, and conflict management, is those last 2 where we want our team members to challenge the leader, or we want our team members to contribute and share whatever they want to share. So often, I see people sitting there with brilliant ideas, and then they're just too afraid to speak up. It might be because of the behavior of the leader. It might be because of the laughter of the team members, because it was a way out idea. But I think building that psychological safety is absolutely critical. I don't know, Eric, if you want to build on that or add something to this concept of psychological safety.
Yeah. Anja, I think you've done an excellent job of explaining it. The only thing I'd add, sometimes leaders take it for granted. They think it is there. They assume that it's there, but the very fact that there isn't psychological safety, people won't speak out. Therefore, there won't be any signal that it's not there, if I'm making sense. So one almost needs to confirm that it is existing, that it does exist. Are people able to speak out? Is everyone's voice heard? Do people fear any retribution if they do or say something? And leaders need to ask those questions. Then you can go into a collaborative problem-solving process. And then with psychological safety, conflict is seen as productive. Because conflict, if productive, will result in innovation. Conflict, if unproductive, becomes disruptive, and it'll kill everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's that. Yeah, I just add that.
And I think what's also important, Eric, is for us just to stop for a moment and think what is not psychological safety, because a lot of the times when we talk about a culture of psychological safety, people think we encouraging that it's an environment where everyone gets along and everyone is happy, and it's exactly not that. I think it's so important for us to realize that psychological safety simply means that we will be open to experimentation, but we still keep you accountable. It means that we will tolerate learning, let's say from mistakes or from experimentation, but we will not necessarily tolerate incompetence. And I think it's those small tweaks that is important to note when we think of psychological safety. But I love what you say is ask, have a conversation around, do we have psychological safety? And you will actually see it in the behavior of your teams. If they talk, if they speak up in meetings, when you pose a question, do they actually respond or not? So I think let's perhaps switch gears and talk a little bit about conflict management. And when we talk about conflict management, I would love to hear the views of the delegates on the screen, and I would like to hear from you. What is your best piece of advice on conflict management? So I'm looking out in the chat to see if you have to give us today one piece of advice. What would that be? When you think of conflict management, what would that be?
If I may come in.
Okay, so I see we have Liesel saying active listening. Leanne say listen before you speak. I love that. It's almost about listening to understand rather than listening to respond. So a lot of listening, never act on impulse, tackle it, don't let it fester. Absolutely, yeah. Who said that? I can't, Graham, yes, absolutely. I think it's such an important point. To say, don't let it fester, be a good listener. So I see a lot of listening here, non-judgmental. Yeah, and I think if we then go back to some of those softer skills that we touch on, I think we can see it's that non-judgmental whenever there's an idea, whenever there's a suggestion, but specifically in conflict manager, focus on the actual problem and not the person. Yeah, so often we see when there's interpersonal conflict, especially in the work environment. Let's take your example, Eric, between sales and let's say the sales team and the consulting team or the client support team. So often when there's conflict, how easy is it going to a personal level and not the behavior of that individual? Focus on the actual problem. Self-mastery, to know to listen when your emotions are high. Clarity, lovely. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. So let me perhaps build on what you've mentioned. And if we can have a look at the next slide, often when we think of conflict management, people think that conflict management is really focused on the interpersonal conflict, that middle circle where we refer to conflict between two individuals. So often we think it's about being at odds with my manager, or perhaps being at odds with a peer in a different department. From a personal perspective, it might even be being at odds with your partner or your significant other. And I think when we then have a look at conflict, it is so important to know that it actually starts with that intrapersonal conflict. And that's what I love about the conflict management course. It's not only giving us skills on how to handle the interpersonal conflict. It really starts with, I want to say, the root cause of that intrapersonal conflict where you have conflict with yourself. And let me perhaps share an example where one of my clients recently phoned me. He was super excited because he got a job at a new multinational organization as a new development consultant, so also on the sales side of the business. And the reason why he was so excited about joining that specific organization was simply, as he put it, that Anja, there has been a lot of alignment between what's important to me and the values of the organization. So he highlighted values like commitment to quality, service excellence, and he specifically highlighted integrity. And what was interesting, about 6 months into his new job, he gave me a call and he said, Anja, I now have a predicament. I'm not sure what to do. And I said, okay, but tell me a little bit more. You were so keen to join the organization, etc. And he said, so one value of mine is to act with integrity. And as I was preparing for a big sales presentation, my manager actually requested that I leave out something that is critical. It's actually, I don't want to call it a flaw, but let's call it a flaw as part of the explanation that I need to hide from the client. And you know me, Anja, I'm all about transparency. And what beautiful example of intrapersonal conflict where Heinrich at that moment had to decide, okay, I'm now torn between my focus on transparency and my level of integrity versus, presenting something to a client which is not really true. And I think what we need to remember when we think of conflict is irrelevant if it's interpersonal conflict between you and another or organizational conflict based on all those examples that Eric shared earlier. It really starts with there's a torn inside yourself between conflicting either thoughts or values or even belief systems. And in the training, I think, Eric, you mentioned self-awareness earlier. And in the training, we actually go a little bit deeper into how do you then need to understand yourself? And what is the self-reflection needed in order to close that gap when you think of intrapersonal conflict? I think the one that we often talk about is the interpersonal one. I mean, even if I look at some of the comments in the chat where you guys mention about being an active listener and don't wait, don't fester, address the situation immediately. I think it really all boils back to the interpersonal conflict. But when you're sitting here today and you might be in a role of a leader, it is absolutely crucial for us to know how do we handle organizational conflict. And I think your example, Eric, was such a beautiful one where sales is saying this and customer service is saying something different. Yeah. Another example of organizational conflict that I often hear nowadays is the whole conflict about hybrid working. And I had a client the other day that said, for whatever reason, management decided everyone needs to be back at the office on Monday, and it was havoc. And suddenly there was organizational conflict because the one team found their rhythm into the hybrid ways of working. And the other team say, yes, but we do need to see one another face to face. And that's just one example of, organizational conflict. But as a leader, what tools do you have in your toolkit to think about all these challenges that you face? And what is your responsibility in supporting the team working through these conflicts? It might be problem solving, it might be critical thinking, it might be something else as well. I don't know, Eric, would you like to add something here to the 3 types of conflict?
Anja, thank you. Just on the organizational conflict, this is where the paradoxical thinking that we spoke about earlier on comes to play, because there are a whole bunch of paradoxes that are present in organizations. Do we reward the individual or the team? Do we centralize or decentralize? Et cetera, et cetera. And the paradoxical thinking is about straddling these apparently contradictory perspectives. And instead of thinking either reward the team or reward the individual, either decentralize, we need to think about both and. To what extent are we able to capture the innovation that exists in this polarity management? So, organizational conflict usually, a lot of the time, happens because of these paradoxes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I have seen as well, Eric, is often, I want to say, tension between the structure and the values.
Yeah.
So the structure is saying one thing, but the values or what we believe is something totally different. And then, as you say, the tension that we have there as well. And that is what we do in the conflict management model. We really unpack all these concepts and have a look at, but what are some techniques and tools that you can look at to resolve each and every one.
Yeah.
But I would like perhaps to close with one last concept here. If we go to the next slide, we call it the conflict continuum. And I was smiling because Belinda earlier on said, Anja, but what is a conflict seeker? And I said, okay, let me answer that question when I get here to the conflict continuum, because what I mean by a conflict seeker is an individual that's not shying away from, tackling something head on. Perhaps I must, and I don't know if I have to, but if you want to, in the chat, share with me when you're in conflict with someone. Let's take the interpersonal conflict. Let's keep it work related and say you have a conflict with one of your colleagues. What is the time since the conflict happened until you have the courage to speak up and address it? So let's see if there's one or two delegates that's courageous enough to share their reality with us. How long does it take for you, since you're aware of that, whatever situation might be where there's a little bit of friction, until you speak up? And this is a safe environment, so obviously you can share with us. Great. I see that Nelia is saying immediately, and Glenda is saying max 2 days. Madeleine saying a day or two. Kim, I'm smiling. I'm hiding under the table. Yeah, I think there's more people that can relate with you. The next day, 24 hours, the same day. Yeah, great. Thank you everyone for sharing.
Even
So Eric, must I ask you, what is your lag time between, identifying it and addressing it?
So Anja, I think for me, it would depend on the extent to which my core values are being challenged.
Okay.
So if it's about, if I'm in conflict with someone because one of my core values is being challenged, immediately.
Okay.
If it's a disagreement on a strategy, then I might be a little bit, in fact, maybe too slow, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, it depends on what the conflict causes. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your view. And I can remember in the beginning of my career, I was really avoiding conflict.
Yeah.
I was one of those people, Skim, and that's why I was smiling, because I think I was on the same side, hiding away from the conflict. And I've learned, because it's a skill that you learn, is how do you handle conflict more effectively? Because there's actually so much value in having a constructive debate. And I think that's why I say if you're a conflict seeker, it's actually someone that say, yes, I am willing to speak up. Yes, I am willing to tackle the issue. I want to share a stat. Crucial Learning, they did a research study and they found that their study said that 25% of individuals wait more than 1 year before they address an issue. And that's a long time, yeah? So what we try to illustrate here on the conflict continuum is you will see that on the one side, we have artificial harmony. And on the opposite side, we have those destructive personal attacks. And then right in the middle, that's where we actually have what we call the optimal zone. Because I don't know about you, but Eric, I often see teams that's focused so much on the harmony in the team, the sense of belonging. We want to focus on that, we're part of a group, that they're actually agreeing when inside they're screaming, no, this is a bad plan, it's not going to work. But they just don't have the courage to speak up.
Yeah.
And then on the other side of the continuum is, as some of you said, it's going to that personal side, and we totally forgetting about what is the real issue that we're addressing right now. So when you have a look at this conflict continuum, and you have a look at the line where you see the optimal zone in the middle, I am curious to hear from your side, thinking of the teams where you currently operate. Where do you fall? Do you fall to the side of artificial harmony? Or do you fall on the other side of the continuum of perhaps more destructive attacks? Because I think when we talk about conflict management, this is an important awareness for us to see where do we operate. And this is perhaps a question that you can take back to your teams to say, okay, team, when we have a look at this conflict continuum, where are we? And what might be part of or some of the root causes why we operate on this side or the other side of the continuum. So let's have a look. I see someone saying that they fall on the artificial harmony side. Let's hear one or two more.
And while we wait for people to maybe put stuff into the chat, I think there's also a stunning link that you can make here between where you are or where a team is on the continuum and the conversation you had earlier on about psychological safety. Because Absolutely. In the absence of psychological safety, we will hold hands, smile at each other, sing kumbaya together, and it festers. Yeah. You know, the conflict gets swept under the carpet, and in the absence of psychological safety, we won't have the robust conversation.
Yeah. And what I see, team, is that all the answers so far in the chat seems to be on the artificial harmony side. So my invitation for you would be join us, come share your learnings with us on the conflict management, and let's give you some tools to move towards that optimal zone of handling irrelevant, if it's intrapersonal, interpersonal, or organizational conflict.
Yeah.
Great. So, Eric, I see we have about 5 minutes left. Let's leave the 5 minutes for Q&A. And I would love to hear if there's anyone that want to ask anything or make a comment based on what myself and Eric shared today. So let's see if there's anyone that still have a comment or a question.
Anja, I don't think they are. I think we've done a good job of answering questions. Jonathan, you've got a question. Johnson, sorry. Ron.
I didn't want to leave you guys hanging. I thought that was terrible. I just wanted to say thank you. I'll give a comment. This has been extremely helpful. I really do appreciate it. I think my key takeaway is that problem dissolving concept. I really, really appreciated that. Yeah, it's been very useful. I have enjoyed it thoroughly. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the feedback.
Good.
Anja, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It was lovely collaborating with you today.
I'm getting involved again now too. I hope everyone can hear me. I just want to take a moment to thank you both for your time today and the insightful conversation. I think you've created a beautiful space where people have asked so many wonderful questions, and I think still have more questions to keep going. And we will obviously share the recording and the slides because I'm sure everyone's going to go back and think about this. I have taken like key ideas from this. It's conflict dissolving, blame storming. Something that is going to stick is we were born curious. So I'm sure there's going to be these other moments that stick with everyone else too. In speaking about this, and to let everybody know who's joined today, and we thank you for your time, MasterStart now does have these 2 courses, and these are our 2 wonderful industry experts who will be leading them. So if you'd like to get a little bit more involved there, please reach out. We've shared their details on the slides, their LinkedIn profiles. Please get in touch. Get in touch with MasterStart. We're here to connect with everybody. And yeah, I just want to thank you all again for your time and taking time out of your day. And this was a really wonderful session.
Thank you, Jessamine. And thank you, MasterStart. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely collaborating, Eric, and it was lovely meeting everyone on the call.
Likewise.
Such a good session.
We'll see you all on the courses that you're going to register for.
Thanks, guys.
I like that
Thanks,
way
everybody.
of thinking.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Really
Yes,
great
thank
course.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.